All right, let's start on topic 4.6, monetary policy, or module 27 in your textbook. We're going to try to split this one up into two videos. I think we can get away with that. All right, so now that we know there's a demand for money and we looked at money supply and money demand and those sort of things, now we get to move on to some of the easier topics. I think these are easier. So, first let's talk about money supply and who sets that number. We already kind of talked about that a little bit in 4.5. Let's get into it and how they set that number and how they control it and how they shift it and so on. So the supply of money in each country is usually set by a central bank. Um, so there's some central authority who controls the money supply or tries to control the money supply and relationship with interest rates and blah 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 blah. All right, so they're going to set the amount, and that's why it's a vertical supply curve. It is a set straight up amount. Like they set the quantity, so it's going to be a straight line on a graph. Central Bank of the U.S. is called the Federal Reserve. We've had it for about 100 years now. So the Federal Reserve, I think it was Woodrow Wilson's presidency, I think. I could be wrong, though. But the Central Bank of the U.S. is the Federal Reserve, and you've probably heard of that before in your life. They took over the money issuing from Congress and the Mint. So if you read the Constitution, it says that the Congress has the ability to create the mints and print money. Basically, they just hand this over now to the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve is a bank, but it's a central bank, but it is not a bank for you and me. It is a bank for banks. You don't go to the Federal Reserve and put your paycheck in there. They basically are there to try to stabilize and control the banking system in the United States of America. Because the banking system is important and it encourages our economic growth, but left unchecked, it can create huge swings in the economy. And fear in the economy runs on the banks and that sort of stuff. So the Federal Reserve is there to try to prevent a lot of that stuff. They split the country up into 12 regions. I'm not going to put a map on there because you don't need to know that for this class, but you can look it up online. They split the country into 12 different regions. They each have their own little boards, and then there's this chief executive board, and you've probably heard of the chairman of the Fed, who is somebody you'll oftentimes see on the news. They try not to be political, but they're oftentimes wrapped into political garbage, the circles around money and fiscal policy or monetary policy. So anyways, they supervise the banks in the region, set reserve requirements, discount rates, and blah, 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 blah. They generally create something called monetary policy. Whenever you see Federal Reserve, know that we're probably talking about monetary policy. We're talking about money policy, okay? Government, which was kind of like last unit we did, government sets the fiscal policy. So government will set how much they're going to buy, their budget, how much they're going to buy, what they're going to tax, what they're going to transfer. These are all fiscal policy tools, right? So the government can get involved buying, tanks or whatever, or increasing unemployment insurance or whatever, decreasing taxes. These are all things that the government can do. That's fiscal policy. The Federal Reserve is going to do things to manipulate money, the money supply largely, and that's all monetary policies. So that's the main difference between the Federal Reserve and, say, the White House and Congress. White House, Congress, fiscal policy; Federal Reserve, monetary policy. All right, so how do they do this? How does the Federal Reserve do its job? And we'll get into how they actually do all these things detailed here in a second. So central banks have four main tools, at least in the United States of America, and most other countries are pretty similar. Central banks have four main tools to control the economy: reserve rates, which we've already talked about, federal fund rates, discount rates, and open market operations. That's the really fun one. That's the one that maybe is a little strange. All of these will impact the money supply, interest rates, and GDP. And next unit, Unit 5, is where we really dive into monetary policy's impact on, on the economy, on GDP and stuff. We'll look at all the causal relationships between these things. Discount rates and open market operations basically create money. So these two are fun there. And yeah, if you think about it, we need more money from time to time. We obviously have more money today. The money supply has grown than it was, let's say, 50 years ago, and that should be logical. There's a bigger GDP, there's more transactions, there's more stuff, there's more people. So obviously we need more money. These two things will basically be what creates money. All of these tools will be impacted by the multiplier. And you might be saying, well, which multiplier, Mr. Malcolm? You give me so many. All right, good question. Well, fiscal policy is going to be your spending multiplier, tax transfer multipliers, right? That's going to be fiscal policy. So fiscal policy, taxing, transferring, spending multipliers, that's where that lives. This multiplier, well, we're talking about money, so it's probably going to be the money multiplier. So monetary policy, all of these are going to be, if you have to do any calculations or manipulations, it's going to be the money multiplier. So, and money multiplier obviously uses the reserve requirement. That's very important to note for that part. So we've already talked about the reserve requirement. We've talked about it a lot actually because of the money multiplier, and we've used it already. But now we just have to go over some little details here. So the reserve requirement, the Federal Reserve gets to set the rate. If things are getting inflationary, so let's say the economy is running a little too hot, and we're going to talk more about all these next in the next unit too. So unit 5 goes into these a lot more detail. But if things are getting a little too inflationary, so the economy is running a little too hot, or consumers aren't confident in the banks, they're we're worried there might be another run on the banks. People are not. They're like, oh, is my money actually safe in the bank or so on? The Federal Reserve might say, hey, banks, right now usually you have to keep 10%. Well, now you have to keep 20. You have to keep 20%. And by the way, for the first like 50 years, I want to say the Federal Reserve existed, it was closer to 20%. The reserve requirement used to be much higher than this. So the banks might say, or the Federal Reserve might say, hey, banks, you have to keep more than 10% now because consumers aren't confident. They're not sure that their money's safe in your banks. We want to make sure that they're safe. We want to make sure the banking system doesn't collapse. So you have to start putting away a little bit more money. If things are inflationary, if the economy is running too hot, they would up the reserve requirement because that means banks have to keep more money in their reserves, and that pulls that money out of the economy. It's not money that's being loaned out to people. So if it's harder to get loans, or it's harder to get loans, and interest rates are going to be going up, probably there's not as much money available because banks have to set more aside. So if things are getting inflationary, they'll up that amount, and people will not be able to get loans. It slows down the inflationary economy. So hopefully that makes a little bit of sense. And we'll look more into that next in Unit 5. So upping the amount will basically prevent inflationary economies and increase confidence. So I made this a while ago. So in the U.S., the rate is often set at 10%, and on the College Board on your AP exams, they're usually going to use 10% as your example. Make sure you read it, though, especially if you're ever using something with the money multiplier, because they might try to trip you up. They might give you different numbers. They'll say, like, well, it's 20% or 25%. And we've already done some examples where the reserve requirement is different. Just remember that this is important for your money multiplier, so make sure you always check. The default... I hate to say it because then it's going to screw somebody up. But the default is usually 10%, but keep your eyes open. 10% is usually considered the safe and solid number, and it's been 10% for a long time. Reducing the reserve requirement is kind of a dangerous thing below 10%, and we'll talk more about why that might be dangerous more so in Unit 5. But usually the Federal Reserve keeps the interest rate at 10%. All right. So what if you don't have any reserves? What if your bank decided one day just, what? People want loans, we're going to loan them money because if I'm a bank, I want to give out loans because that's how I make my money. I make interest off those loans. So let's say I'm a bank, I'm like, I'm going to loan out all of this money. Forget the Federal Reserve, but then like 4:30 is rolling around, it's the end of the banking day, and you're like, oh crap, I'm in violation of the law. What can I do? Well, actually, a lot of banks do this every day. Not every bank, but a lot of banks do this every day. They're very aggressive with their loaning. But at the end of the day, in order to be federally compliant and not violate federal law, they have to figure out a way to cover their butts. And this is where the federal funds rate comes into play. So the federal fund rate is basically, this is what you're actually going to hear a lot about on the news when they say like the federal interest rate. This is usually what they're talking about, unless they specify discount rates and stuff like that. This is usually what they're talking about. So in order to avoid punishment, which is fines and possibly even closures if it was a long time thing, banks will take overnight loans to meet their reserve requirement. So remember, standard reserve requirement is 10%. So if you're at the end of the day, you're looking at your T-chart, it's obviously going to be massive if you're a big bank. But you're looking at your chart and you're like, ooh, man, I need to keep at least 10% of all of my liabilities. I need to keep at least 10% overnight. Otherwise, I'll get fined or possibly even closed. What banks will do is they will get overnight loans from other banks who didn't loan out all their money. So there are banks that basically banks give loans to other banks. Typically, they're just overnight. So the next morning, that bank will have to pay out basically their loan. So hopefully they're getting enough income from their interests and all these other things that they're getting, and they can pay that bank, the other bank back, and make on their 10% loan, essentially, to maintain their reserve requirement. So the current rate is set at 1.75%. Once again, I made these. That number moves around a lot. So, oh shoot, did I close? No. That number moves around a lot. But the federal funds rate was about 1.75%. That's incredibly low, by the way, too. I mean, right now, currently, beginning of April, it's 0% again. During the Great Recession, we dropped it down to 0%. But basically what that means is that banks can get loans from other banks for 0% interest to cover their butts. That's pretty low. We've seen it into double digits. You know, the federal funds rate used to be much higher, especially if you go back and look at like the early 80s. It was incredibly high. And why does that matter? Well, if the rate is super low, like 1.75%, in my opinion, is still pretty low, and 0% is even lower than that, obviously. If it's really low, then banks have an incentive to loan out as much money as possible, because getting an overnight loan for them is no real big deal. They're not going to lose anything. They're not going to have to pay any interest if it's at 0%. And so lowering that rate encourages banks to loan money. They have no reason not to loan out basically all their reserves. So some banks that are very aggressive with their loaning will continually loan and continually dump money out into the economy. And that's usually seen as a good way to boost the economy. If it's easier to get business loans, then businesses are more likely to get loans, and then they're more likely to spend that money and increase the economy and so on and so forth. All right. Obviously, increasing the rate makes it a little harder. Banks are a little less likely to empty their reserves. You know, if the rate was, let's say, 20% or something really ridiculously high, banks are not going to be emptying their reserves every day. They're not going to be giving out as many loans, and that will slow the economy down. Now, this is a powerful tool. It is a very powerful tool, and it's the one that the Federal Reserve manipulates the most. Reserve requirements they rarely touch. Very rarely touch. That has to be an extreme situation for reserve requirements to change. Federal fund rates, though, is usually their first action that they're going to take, and they change it every few months. Oftentimes, sometimes they don't change it at all, but they will change it. And what happens is when you drop it down to 0, then it's really hard to bring back up, because people are like, oh, well, it's going to hurt the economy. And it will slow down the economy a little bit, bringing that rate back up. However, if you don't bring that rate back up, the tool is useless. If you're at 0%, it's really hard to go below that. And so you have to bring it back up so that when the economy does go down again, remember we live in a cyclical economy, you can drop it down again. So it's one of those things. Everybody loves when it goes down, nobody likes when it goes up, but it must go back up eventually. Otherwise, the tool doesn't exist. This one probably won't be on your AP exam, but I do want to point it out because I think this is a very important one. The federal fund rates, the federal interest rate, is set by the Federal Reserve Bank. It's set by a group of bankers who sit down and say, this is what we want to see happen. We want the economy to grow. We want the economy to shrink. They're trying to change money supply. They're trying to change interests and all that sort of stuff, interest rates and stuff. So it's very much, it's a tool. There's another number, though, that is very famous and you may hear about in your life. It's called the LIBOR number, London Interbank Offered Rate, LIBOR. This one is a reflection, whereas this one is like a tool. This is set by a group of people. The LIBOR number is a reflection. It's not set by an organization, but it's more based on supply and demand. And the banks demanding loans, London Interbank Offered Rate. So how the banks are offering loans to each other, their interest rates to each other. So this is a reflection of how the banks actually feel. If the banks are worried about the economy, that interest rate, the LIBOR number, will go up. If the banks are confident in the economy and they believe everything's stable and possibly even growing, the interest rate goes down because there's lower risk. And so the LIBOR number is a better reflection of how the economy is actually doing. Whereas this one, the federal funds rate in America, is a tool. The LIBOR number is a reflection. It's based on 5 global currencies. And why is it important? Well, because, and unfortunately this is kind of hindsight, but the LIBOR rate is a good indicator of what's going on in the economy. When you see giant spikes in the LIBOR rate, that's often a good sign that the economy is going to be running into some bumpy times. So right before the Great Recession, the LIBOR rate shot up. And, once again, this is all hindsight. It's easier to look at later. There were some economists who were talking about it, saying this is something to be worried about, but you know, half the time you're right, half the time you're wrong. Usually you're wrong with economic stuff. It's complicated. So, nowadays we look back and say, oh, yeah, the LIBOR number was a good indicator that banks were worried because banks like Bear Stearns was failing. There were subprime mortgages. All these things were going on. We couldn't have known that at the time, or at least, not everybody was 100% sure at the time. So, you may hear the LIBOR number. If you ever hear about the LIBOR number shooting up, maybe, don't panic, but maybe keep your eyes open, because that might be a sign that the banks are worried that something's going on, and then that could trickle throughout the rest of the world. So federal funds rate, the federal interest rate, LIBOR rates is another version. All right, so discount rate. Oh no, your bank's going underneath. Oh no, you're collapsing. But some banks are too big to fail. Now, definitely, that's a philosophical question, I guess. Some people, say, well, capitalism, supply and demand, and businesses that don't do well should fail. Like, should fail. Not just that they can fail, they should fail. If you're running a restaurant and you're losing money or hemorrhaging money, that restaurant should close. Like, that's the standard belief, right? That's strict capitalism. However, some people believe that some banks and some car companies and things like that are too big to fail, that if they were to collapse, the impact on the economy would be monstrous, and so the government will do things to support them. Government can do all sorts of fiscal policy things to support the industry, but the Federal Reserve also can do monetary things to help support banks. So let's say your bank needs cash, right? And you need a lot of cash. The Federal Reserve can give you a direct loan. Now, not you and me. This goes to banks. This would go to giant banks. Like, we're talking like probably Chase and stuff like this. By the way, this does not happen that often. But let's say your bank's going out of business and you're like Capital One or something, and you're a big bank that a lot of people use. The Federal Reserve might give you a direct loan. They give you a direct loan, and the interest rate is what's called the discount rate. It's usually slightly above the federal funds rate, which is still pretty small, and they're going to give you a direct loan. Basically, if you think about this, the Federal Reserve is printing money. And today, it's usually not even printed actual paper money. It's just moving numbers around on a spreadsheet. They're just like changing numbers, adding zeros essentially. But the bank will get direct influx of cash from the Federal Reserve. Money is created out of nothing and given directly to the bank at an interest rate. And that interest rate we call the discount rate. This doesn't happen that often, but it can happen as one of the tools of the Federal Reserve. And this is one of the ones that creates money. So basically, they could print the money. Usually today, they just digitally do it. This is the interesting one. So open market operations. So open market operations. This is going to use the open market, and the Federal Reserve is going to do things in the open market operations. So let's talk about the background of how this happens and what's going to go on. This one, the Federal Reserve does a lot. It's related to quantitative easing, which I'm not going to go into because it's not part of the CED, but it's something that if you study what happened during the Great Recession and how we tried to get out of it, you'll learn a lot about that. Anyways, so when the U.S. government needs to cover its budget deficits, so the U.S. government, huge budget deficit, right? We have a huge amount of debt. It sells something called treasury bills. You might hear these called T-bills. So treasury bills or T-bills. And they sell these to commercial banks. Notice that I made it italicized, commercial banks. But wait a second, Mr. Malcolm, the Federal Reserve is the Bank of the United States of America. Sure, but the Federal Reserve needs to be separate from the U.S. government. The U.S. government sets fiscal policy, the Federal Reserve sets monetary policy. Okay, so think about this. Federal Reserve makes money and controls the money supply. If the U.S. government could just spend money with abandon, right? And if they need more money, they just print more money to spend. If the government could do this, what's to stop them? Their incentive is to buy more tanks and buy more bombs and build highways and do all this great stuff, right? But if they're just printing money to bankroll all this stuff, the money supply is going to go way out of whack. And so that's dangerous. That's going to cause massive inflation. And you're saying, well, that's impossible. That would never happen, right? Well, look at 1920s Germany, right? Look at any situation where you have hyperinflation. It's usually where the government is taking control of the money supply, and the government is producing more money to sell it or to fund their addiction, their spending addiction. So this is a little different. In the United States of America, the Federal Reserve is separate from the government. The government, if it needs to cover its budget deficits, it has to find people willing to buy its debt, right? They have to sell these treasury bills, which are basically like short-term bonds. All right, so they sell these T-bills to commercial banks, not the Federal Reserve. So never directly to the Fed. If the Federal Reserve was at the beck and call of the government and just said, the government says, hey, we need more money printed out, and they did it, then we would run into situations with hyperinflation. In this case, commercial banks have to want U.S. debt. They have to look at the U.S. government and say, yeah, I think you're still going to pay me back. I think you're sure still a deal here. Still a short deal here, so I'm going to loan you this money essentially, because that's kind of what a bond is. It's a loan, basically, like a short-term loan. And so commercial banks buy these T-bills with the belief that the U.S. government will pay them back. And the U.S. government has a credit rating. All right, countries have credit ratings too. We have a pretty good credit rating. We're not in the top credit rating in the country. We're not Canada or anything like that, but we do have a pretty decent credit rating. And so banks will loan us money essentially short term. So treasury bills cover our deficits, are sold to commercial banks, and they are not coming directly from the Fed. So not directly from the Fed, but the Fed is going to get involved now next. They can get involved if they choose to. Just I need you to understand this is the background of what's going on. So the U.S. government's covering its deficits with treasury bills. They go to commercial banks. Now let's get involved with the Fed. So let's say the Federal Reserve decides to increase the money supply. One way they could do it is discount rate and stuff like that, but that's actually not that common. This is usually what's going to happen more so. So the Federal Reserve wants to increase the amount of money that exists. This will bring, and we'll talk more about this stuff in Unit 5. This will bring down the interest rate, increase the amount of money in the economy, it will encourage growth, yada, yada, yada. What the Federal Reserve can do is they can purchase treasury bonds from those commercial banks that bought them with money they've just printed. Or like I said, mostly today it's just digital transfers, but the Federal Reserve can then do an open market operation, so go out, just like you or me or a bank can go and buy bonds and stuff like that. Well, the Federal Reserve can too. And they will go buy these treasury bonds. They're buying government debt, essentially. So now they are going to be the holders of the government debt, not the commercial bank anymore. And they're going to buy it with money they have just created. So think about that. The money they just created is now out in the economy. The money now just went to that commercial bank. So they basically gave an influx of cash. They created money out of nothing. And I know you're like, well, that's not fair. Well, that's how money supply works. They create that money, they give it to the banks, and the banks then use that money to increase growth, to encourage growth in the economy. They now have more money that they can loan out. They have more money that they can keep in their vaults, perhaps, too. I mean, that also does happen. But the Federal Reserve creates money by buying treasury bonds from commercial banks. Hopefully that makes sense right there. This is called an open market operation. That bond then becomes an asset of the Fed. So they have, they're increasing their own values and stuff like that. And then hold on here, because the next thing they can do is they can sell it. If the economy is too inflationary, so let's say we're running too hot, they can stop buying and then they can even sell their assets. So think about what's going to happen here. The Federal Reserve is a bank, but remember, it's not a bank that you and I go to, right? Their vaults are kind of like, once the money goes into their vaults, it's pretty much shut out. They're not worried about like loaning money to you and me or to Amazon or something like that. They're not loaning money to corporations. Their vaults are different. So if the economy is running too inflationary, they can stop buying and maybe they even sell their assets. Well, think about this. If they sell one of their treasury bonds, all right, and they can buy other things too. That's quantitative easing. We're just talking about treasury bonds here. But let's say they start selling these treasury bonds back to people. Well, think about it. People give them money. So a bank gives them money for their treasury bonds. And then that money goes to the Federal Reserve. That money then sits in their vault and is taken out of circulation. If you take money out of circulation and put it in a Federal Reserve vault, well, what's going to happen to the money supply? The money supply will be reduced because now there is less money available. That money that could have been being loaned out to people and stuff like that in an inflationary economy, maybe too much was happening, that money is now set aside in a reserve vault and it's not touched. It's not touched unless they need to increase the money supply later. So it's basically like destroying money. So open market operations, this happens pretty commonly. This is usually how they create or destroy money. And I think that's where we'll stop for this video.